A villain is, more often than not, a victim of unfortunate circumstances, events that erode one's vision of the world and lead them to violently lash out. While those circumstances don't excuse all the atrocities committed by said villain, they still make way for an empathetic, cautionary tale. The Yakuza series is one of the best examples of humanizing villains in believable ways, with the very first villain of the series, Nishiki Akira, still being seen as one of the best in that regard. When Ishin finally hit the West a few months back, Nishiki's counterpart in that game was one of the characters I was looking forward to the most, and the way that RGG handled the story of Okada Izo essentially made for the perfect reimagining of an already iconic villain. From setting a blueprint for subsequent games to explore Nishiki's inherent character depth, to giving us a self-sufficient character with some of the finest examples of Ludo narrative to date, the world of Ishin served as the perfect stage to portray this profound tragedy. But to establish why Izo is the perfect reimagining of a villain, we first need to establish what makes him such a compelling villain in Ishin specifically. They say times of adversity bring out the best in people, and when it comes to the history of Japan, arguably the most intriguing period in that regard is the time frame leading up to the Great Restoration. Everyone was on the edge due to the rampant social inequalities, so a number of villains were bound to be born from such circumstances. Much like his real-life counterpart, Okada Izo was a self-taught swordsman born into a low-ranking family, which ensured him a life of hardship that would eventually lead him to the Tosa Loyalist Party, a group of misfits who would be given a second chance at life thanks to their leader, Takechi Hanpeita. Hanpeita literally said how the party is everything to these people, because Goshi can't get a proper education or job, and with him teaching the people there how to live properly, this made loyalists like Izo revere Hanpeita as the one man who could bring about a massive change. Still, when you take into account how one's societal class is deemed to be more important than life itself, you'd understand why any kind of hierarchy would be seen as crucial to one's perceived value, which sadly extends to the Tosa loyalists themselves. Fortunately for Izo, his natural skill made sure that he would quickly become one of the most highly regarded people there, alongside Takechi himself. And then came the wind of change, in the form of Sakamoto Ryoma, a person who had been away from Tosa for a year, only to be given the position of party representative immediately after returning, making him the second in command in this group that many of its members equated to life itself. You can easily tell why something like this would infuriate Izo. Much like the black ships that invaded Japan and led to the current state of affairs, from Izo's perspective, Ryoma just waltzed into Tosa and was given this important position not based on his abilities, but based on who he knows. Kind of ironic how Ryoma's introduction in Ishin is him returning to Tosa on a black ship with white sails as well. The fact that he genuinely has the skills to prove that he is worthy of said position is irrelevant here, as Izo does not know him. He's a man of few words, who communicates mainly through his combat prowess, which makes for the perfect setup for the first boss fight of the game. By the end of it, Izo lost, despite his personal skill and the people accompanying him, which tangentially planted the seeds for the feelings of self-doubt that would lead him down the path of villainy, and in turn, it birthed a rivalry for the ages. Fast forward 1 year, and Izo is let loose in Kyo. In his eyes, he is one of Takechi's most trusted allies, now that Ryoma has been out of the picture for some time, and you can tell that he doesn't seem as antagonistic towards Ryoma as he was in the first encounter, where he just grunted at him after losing the fight. Now, they actually hold a conversation with one another, seemingly because Izo sees Ryoma as a competent swordsman, thus making him worthy of respect. They share a latent understanding, even though one person made the test the other. This is one of the aspects that makes Izo such a remarkable foil to Ryoma, because both of them grow equally with each subsequent fight they have, since Izo remarked how in the year that had passed, Ryoma started fighting like a killer himself. something that Ryoma remarked about the former during the first fight. But as tensions within Japan rise as the story progresses, so too does the tension between Ryoma and Izo, evolving this fun rivalry of theirs into a matter of life and death. They both started wearing a mask of sorts to hide their weaknesses and self-doubts. For Izo, it's the mask of the infamous butcher, a figure perhaps even more feared than the Shinsengumi themselves in the eyes of the public. As for Ryoma, his mask is that of Saito Hajime, a hopeless gambler who stumbled his way into the Shinsengumi to supposedly live a comfortable life. And at the root of both of these personas is the same person, but for drastically different reasons. As ironic as it may be, Takechi and his drive to be the symbol of change birthed both the greatest hero and the most remarkable villain of the Bakumatsu era without even realizing it. In a lot of ways, it is the conflict between Ryoma and Izo specifically that defines the story of Ishin, rather than the ideological conflict between Ryoma and Takechi. Izo's fights capped off most of the major points of the story, and he was a persistent wall that Ryoma had to surmount in his own journey of growth, much like Izo had to surmount Ryoma in his pursuit of fulfillment. The reason Izo took countless lives was that he was seeking affirmation from Takechi, one of the few people he still had in his life, and a person who believed that bloodshed was an inevitability in leading a revolution. On the other hand, the reason why Ryoma became Saito Hajime was to avenge his father figure. Yet, when all the evidence pointed towards his brother being the architect of this tragedy, he still kept searching for a different answer. These two kept lying to themselves as they moved forward, and the only way they can move on with their lives would be to fight one last time. Like I've alluded to before, there's a type of understanding that can only be achieved through combat. A way of communicating without masks or pretenses, and it came from two broken people colliding over and over until they could finally be what the other person needed the most. A wake-up call. At the end of this fight, there is no more Izo the Butcher. There is no more Saito Hajime. Just two people who started off as the villains of each other's stories, but wound up being the heroes instead. Considering what was stated in the previous segment, it's easy to see why Izo could be regarded as such a remarkably written character, but as is the case with most elements of the Yakuza series, the real genius lies beneath the surface. There is a number of amazing videos on what makes Nishiki one of the best villains in the series, with this video by Oni being one of my personal favorites. But if you've been with the series since day one, you'll remember how it took some time for him to become as impactful as he is today. Part of the reason for that is the added narrative depth that gradually came from Yakuza 0 and the added scenes from Yakuza Kiwami. But I would argue that the way Okada Izo was portrayed in Ishin is in a lot of ways the reason why this cohesive image of Nishiki came to be in the first place. According to an interview with Sakamoto Hiroyuki and Uehara Yasuaki, the reasoning behind specific characters from Yakuza being chosen to embody specific historical figures had a lot to do with overlapping motivations and personalities. We know that Ishin as a whole is only partially historically accurate as well, with the crucial events being faithful to their real-life stories, but the path of getting to those points taking creative liberties. The end result is a proper, character-driven story, meaning that the way Ishin portrays its main cast can be seen as an extension of their counterparts from the mainline games. With that in mind, I'd like to point out that the original Ishin was released 1 year before Yakuza 0 and 2 years before Kiwami, which means that this version of Nishiki was the first example of redefining his character from Yakuza 1. And this is incredibly important because Ishin essentially completes a circle alongside the best friend figure from 0 and the tragic villain from Kiwami by giving us a version of the character that is taken to a dark extreme. In Kiwami, we've known that Nishiki had taken drastic steps to ensure his family's growth and his own rise through the ranks of the Tojo, but the actions he had personally taken weren't shown as frequently as you'd imagine. He wasn't meant to be seen as someone that's evil for the sake of being evil, as every added scene from his past doubles down on the tragedy of his actions. So what did Ishin do? It gave us a version of Nishiki that we would have seen if Kiryu hadn't intervened after leaving prison. The version of Nishiki that was wreaking havoc while Kiryu was still imprisoned and after his sister tragically passed away. Even down to the color palette, Izo is an inherently dark character, someone whose brutality and prowess defines his reputation in the world very openly. While Nishiki in Kiwami was to blame for a number of casualties, he generally hid his involvement in those cases from the public. We only found out how he shot Kazama because he said it to Kiryu in a hollowed-out Serena. The public fears the actions of his family, but can never directly pin those crimes on Nishiki himself, hence the events behind Kiryu proving his innocence in the game. Meanwhile in Ishin, you know full well that it is Izo that took every single life by his own hand, as it's essentially shouted from the rooftops. From the Tosa loyalists near the shrine to the numerous Bakufu officials, this is not the work of a villainous group. This is the work of Izo the Butcher. Someone who dispatched 2 captains of the Shinsengumi within 3 swipes of his sword and didn't even blink. Someone who is always concise and genuinely terrifying in action. This is the version of Nishiki I could see reaching the upper echelon of the Tojo clan. This is the darkest interpretation of that formidable figure that was introduced all the way back in 2005 with the original Yakuza. To me, this is villainy personified. And it put the team at RGG into a position where they could now confidently portray the other side of the emotional extreme. A loyal friend who sticks by you no matter the circumstance. And once Zero masterfully showed that side of him, Kiwami conclusively offered us a tragic middle ground between the positivity in Zero and the darkness in Ishin, though admittedly leaning more towards the darker side of Nishiki. And the influence of Izo doesn't end there. In fact, let's take a closer look at the boss fights with him to explain more. Color choices are very important in Yakuza. It's why we've had Kiryu narratively transition from a white suit to a grey suit in Zero, because, as he himself said it, I'm not feeling black or white these days. This is where I'm at right now. I've already alluded to the opposition between Nishiki's palette in Kiwami and Izo's palette in Ishin, but a similar premise applied to his heat aura as well. Nishiki's heat aura has always been a deep blue, ever since the PlayStation 2 days. But when you look at the aura used in the original release of Ishin, it's a deep red, the color that is always shown in opposition of the former choice. This is seen in a variety of Japanese media, and obviously in Kiwami itself, with Kiryu's dragon style having the aura that once belonged to Izo. But I know that some of you may be confused by these statements, because when you look at Ishin Kiwami, Izo had multiple heat auras, neither of which were red. What's interesting about that is how, when RGG tends to alter a character's heat aura, they default to the new choice being red. But in the case of Izo, these alterations were much more purposeful than a simple aesthetic preference would be. Let's take a look at the first 2 fights. Izo has a gleaming white aura, and he fights us in a group. While he does have violent tendencies shown in his swordplay, at these points in the story, we still perceive him as just a rival, not a murderous villain. And the color of choice can also be seen as a symbol of a blank slate and emotional distance. Yet, by the time we face off against Izo for the 3rd time, his aura is suddenly a deep purple once he challenged us one-on-one. This choice is even mirrored in his special ability, a purple poisonous hurricane that pushes you away or slowly drains your life, just like Izo himself does as the Butcher. And funnily enough, this color is a combination of the other auras associated with this character's roots. Am I getting too much into this? Yeah, probably. So let's go a bit further. If you've seen enough Japanese media or looked up some famous superstitious beliefs, you will have undoubtedly heard how the number 4, and to a lesser extent 9, are seen as unlucky in Japanese culture. This belief mainly draws from one of the potential readings of the associated kanji. with the number 4 also being pronounced as shi, which has a strong resemblance to the word for death. While I myself don't bother with the deeper meanings of numbers in media, it did seem interesting how we fight Izo exactly 4 times, and the only times we fought him in a group, he was associated by 4 allies. It almost felt like foreshadowing how he was doomed to fail in his journey from the beginning. Stepping away from the overt metaphors, a lot of praise should be given to RGG for the locations they've chosen for the boss fights as well. From the first one taking place in the level 0 of the game we never revisit in that peaceful form, to the second one taking place in Mukurogai, an area housing society's rejects, much like Ryoma and Izo had become, to a collapsed gambling den, mirroring the risk of their third encounter. But arguably, the most fitting choice to conclude this conflict between Ryoma and Izo was the setting for the last fight. A calm, desolate courtyard near a temple, as Kyo in its entirety burns to the ground. No distractions, no NPCs rooting for you, just the immeasurable weight of an encounter that will inevitably take one of their lives. This would already be enough of a thorough spotlight to Izo's character, but considering my lengthy history with this series' music, please indulge me as I unravel the brilliance behind one more aspect of this individual. Much like you can embellish your character's qualities through their boss fight and heat aura, the same can be achieved through the accompanying musical piece. And while you don't need to know any music theory to realize that this franchise has phenomenal music, it's a shame we rarely see proper deconstructions of the various themes here, because the composers at RGG were very creative with the way they evolved their songs from segment to segment. So let's take a closer look at Izo's boss themes in Ishin, because the 2 that we got are integral to rounding up this character, especially when compared to the versions Nishiki had in the main lines. The first theme that we hear for Izo is the track called Innocence for Violence, and people who have delved deeply enough into this series' OSTs will immediately see a parallel here. Songs that end with the words "for violence" are frequently tied to encounters with the Nishikiyama family, and they share many elements in common, like the general song structure and the key that they're in. However, these themes were never directly associated with Nishiki himself, but rather the people representing his family, like Shindo in Yakuza Kiwami, for example. So it's interesting how in the first encounter with Izo, where we fought him in a group, the composers opted for Ishin's take on that very boss theme. In fact, Innocence for Violence was used in 3 out of the 4 boss fights we had with Izo, and it fits with the way his motivation is conveyed perfectly. While he does harbor some animosity towards Ryoma, the main reason he fights him is for the sake of the loyalists, or more specifically, Takechi. In the first fight, he is there to mark his territory and proclaim that you don't belong here. After all, a weakling being in the position of the party rep could lead to the crumbling of the loyalists as a whole. In the second fight, he needs to see that you haven't gone soft in the past year if you are to truly aid Takechi. Even in the third boss fight, he's mainly there to carry out his leader's will. He puts Takechi's desires and vision of the world before his own, even though he eventually finds some personal pleasure in fighting Ryoma as well. But ultimately, he isn't directly fighting for his personal beliefs here. He is fighting for someone else's sake. Until... The fourth encounter is the first time that Izo truly puts himself first. Like the title of the theme implies, this fight is for his sake. And while he does want to help Takechi return to normality, for once in this story, he wasn't treated as the undoubtable priority in Izo's mind. This is a fight to solve Izo's insecurities and prove to himself that he is worthy of admiration, respect, and peace. And while the music accompanying this fight is undoubtedly one of the greatest boss themes of the series, You'll notice how, unlike Innocence for Violence, this track isn't a one-for-one rendition of a mainline boss theme. With the exception of For My Sake, every other Nishiki theme fluctuates between three keys: C minor, A sharp minor, and D minor. All you need to know about these is that they share a number of notes with one another, so that the transition from key to key doesn't feel unnatural, all the while still being noticeable. Because of the way that they were utilized, this theme feels like a proper back and forth between two sides of the individual, and serve as the perfect choice to portray a conflicted character. This underlying meaning is essentially present in For My Sake as well. But once you reach the point where the key transition should go up in the opposite direction, that being one step up, the beautiful composers at RGG decided to go with this. Being a musician, this was one of the most satisfying curveballs I've heard in a very long time. So, apart from sounding really cool, what actually happened here? Well, the song initially switched between C minor and A sharp minor, so basically going one step down and then one step up, like I've stated before. But when the segment you've just heard came into play, the composers at RGG incorporated the dominant of the aforementioned chords, more specifically G minor and F minor. Again, to drastically oversimplify it, this segment is used to build tension. Instead of giving you a peaceful resolution you're accustomed to hearing from the other Nishiki themes, these chords make the listener feel even more uneasy than before, which makes the solo section that occurs later on feel infinitely more peaceful and satisfying because of it. And finally, the solo itself is basically the perfect essence of what Izo's character is all about. It starts off simple, with a few uniform notes, but as it evolves, it adds in these frantic bouts that are completely imbalanced and sometimes barely even audible, showing how even in this utmost state of tranquility, there is always a sense of anger, sadness, and unease present at the heart of who Okada really is. Thank you for making it this far. You may be curious as to why this video covered much more ground than my regular analytical pieces. Well, the reason for that is pretty simple. Ishin as a whole is barely talked about these days, and that's something a number of people in the community have remarked. Even though it only came out 3 months ago, even though this was a project that we all hoped would happen for 9 whole years, it seems like Ishin just came and went. Now everyone awaits news on Gaiden and Like a Dragon 8, or are perhaps still stuck grinding away in the infamous dungeons. As of the writing of this script, I've finally obtained the coveted Ishin Platinum, and while going through the story, I remembered how amazing it felt that we actually got to see this game in English. So, seeing as how the heat around it has seemingly died down, I think it's time to reinvigorate the interest in Ishin once again. And I hope that this video will serve as the first step in doing that. This is a very special game for me, because the only reason I got to play it this early was thanks to the people who vocally supported this channel since day one. So, if you're still listening to my hope-filled rambling, please share some love for this game. Let it be talked about as proudly and joyfully as the original once was. And that's all I have to say on the matter. So, until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers.